Okay, the time is now. This is Jay Brown Yoga Talks podcast. My name is Jay Brown. Konnichiwa, my friends. I'm coming to you from a hotel room in Tokyo, Japan. I've been here for 2.5 days now, and I have to be honest with you, I am not at all adjusted to the time yet. It's like 7:45 p.m., but I could easily fall asleep right now. I'm recording this because I'm afraid that if I fall asleep, I'm going to wake up. It's going to be the middle of the night, like 2 or 3 in the morning. Everybody's going to be sleeping. I'm going to feel self-conscious to be recording. So I'm deciding that I just got to do this right now. It's got to happen now, or I'm worried it's not going to happen at all. Hopefully, I will be coherent enough to get through this, but I'm not promising anything. Oh, but man, it's good to be back in Japan. I did come here on a number of occasions in years past, but it's been a little while, almost 2 years since I was last here. I am in Meguro Utenji, which is a fantastic little hip, cool part of Tokyo. And it's great because I've been to Japan enough times that I know how to get around. I don't need a map, and I feel comfortable being here. So it's not like that nervous travel, it's comfortable travel. Just tonight, I went out and had a meal. I had okonomiyaki, Osaka style. If you guys know what I'm talking about. Was it good? If you don't know what it is, it's like eggs and flour and like cabbage and vegetables. I get it with no meat, but they make it like a pancake with this awesome sauce on top. Oh, it's good. But you know what I like the most about Japan is that when I'm here, I never have a sense that anyone is trying to rip me off or get the best of me. Everybody I interact with, for whatever there is that they're doing, that I might be like paying them for, whatever they're doing, there's a certain pride, a certain honor of wanting to do that to the best of their ability and for you to appreciate what they do. And it's just like built on this sort of idea of like being an honorable person who would take value in the other person's efforts. It's so beautiful. And I'm 2 days into a 6-day training. It's going really well so far. The students are amazing. I'm really having a good time with them. Getting to see some old friends. Shout out to my friend Tomoko. So good to see you. I'm feeling really grateful to be here. So for whatever that's worth, I have a pretty amazing talk to share with you today with a very old friend of mine, Molly Lannon Kenny. And I have only met Molly in person one time in my life. We talk about it. It was back in 2009. But man, did I take some inspiration from her. She was a true pioneer. You're going to hear she was like somebody who was doing stuff in yoga service and trauma sensitivity, and she was like the first person I ever met who was talking about this stuff long before it was a conversation the way it is now. And it was so good to connect with her. She was in Mexico. We had like a little bit of a funky internet connection, but you can hear it. It's fine. And just so good to touch base with her and track the last 20 years or so, basically. There's like a real trajectory. And we both sort of followed it together along with the way the ebbs and the flows of the industry have gone. And just we both had a similar viewpoint about practice. And we're singing a similar song back when like nobody else was singing that song. So really, really good to have this conversation with her. I'm excited for you to hear it today. Before we do, let me say something to any of you who are running studios and using Mind Body Online. Most of you know what I'm going to say, right? I think you should consider moving to today's sponsor, KarmaSoft. KarmaSoft is the software that I used to run my center in Brooklyn, and I think it's by far better. It's much easier. It's not so complicated. It doesn't have so many bells and whistles. And what's even better, the owner, Rudy Senegal, is a really hands-on guy who you can actually be in touch with and will take care of stuff. You're not dealing with this huge corporation. You're dealing with like an actual person. And he's been on the show before. You should go back and listen to it. We talked all about my experience of using the software and dealing with the company. I really think it's the way to go. So if you are managing a center and you have to do scheduling of the classes and you got to do the payroll and you got to manage it, you are going to make your life much easier if you use KarmaSoft. Go check it out. Go to karmasoftonline.com. Okay, I think that's it. I'm not really sure if that's it. I don't even have like the little thing. Sometimes I have like little notes that I use to make sure that I say everything I'm supposed to say. Oh, wait, I remember. I want to tell you who's coming on next week. I know I normally leave that to the other side, but it's a big one. Next week, I'm sharing a conversation I had with Guy Donahue. And if you don't know who Guy is, he's the co-author of a book entitled Guruji about Pattabhi Jois. I mentioned it last week. There have been some developments going on there in that community that continues to unfold. I will say a little bit more about that conversation on the other side, but I did want to mention it here just in case so that you know it's happening next week. I really do think it's an important conversation, so just so you know, next week, Guy Donahue, I think you want to tune into that. All right. As I said, I will touch base with you on the other side, and I am slowly fading here, so let's go ahead. Let's get to this conversation that I had with Molly Lannon Kenny. Is this Molly?
This is Molly. This is so exciting. I've never gotten a Skype phone call before.
Well, here you are, and now you have one.
Oh my God, and it's crystal clear.
You can hear okay. Good, I can hear you too. Are you ready to do this? Are you situated? Are you sat down? You got like a glass of water? Do you need to do anything first?
I don't need to do anything. I just have a house that I have to tell to be quiet, and that's a good idea. I'll get a little glass of water. That's perfect. You're a pro at this.
You know, things come up again and again, so you know.
It's amazing what you've done, Jay. I'm like so just like blown away just following you over the years, I gotta say.
I mean, I have to say to you, you're somebody who, gosh, I really have some very distinct memories of you.
I hope they're good.
And we've only met in person once.
Right, yeah. I know, but I feel like I've known you.
I know, because there was like a lot, like there's a lot of parallels, and you were before me, like you were like right before me on a few things. Actually, you were way ahead of the curve on a lot of things. Did you get your water? Are you settled?
I'm sitting, I'm settled, I'm comfy,
okay.
Everything's perfect.
Good. Well, what I was going to say is, I remember the time we met in person was the first time we met was in 2009 at the IYT conference. Do you remember that?
I do. I absolutely do.
And, well, I don't know what you remember about that, but what I remember about you from that is you had already opened a place, the Samaria Center, right, in 2001, I think. Like, you'd been open for a while, and I had just opened my place 2 years prior. And
right. I do remember that.
Interested in meeting people who were kind of doing their own thing in their own places, like I was. And you were so ahead of the curve. You were the first person I ever heard talk about inclusivity, about social justice. And you were like, you had all those diverse people that were coming to your center. I just remember being like, wow, because I was in Brooklyn and it was all very hipster, you know?
Right. Yeah. That's amazing hearing you say that, because I really struggle with like ego, but also like financially too. I guess,
we can get to that part. We can get to that part because the other thing that I remember that is another kind of starting point for us maybe in this conversation is that the other thing I really remembered about you was you, like me, sort of started you were a real Ashtanga practitioner. I just had like an Ashtanga based practice, and then I had moved away from it to like these Desikachar teachings. And I remember was that true? That was true for you too, right? Like you started out in Ashtanga, but then moved away. Is that right? Do I have that right?
Yeah, well, yes, but I didn't really go any other place. I got kicked out of my Ashtanga school. And so I just started practicing by myself. And when I opened Samaria, I was teaching. It was like I was going to teach Ashtanga to pay the bills, basically. And then, so it just morphed its own self. I never studied anything really after that.
Why did you get kicked out of your Ashtanga studio?
Well, it's all getting more clear now. Are you following some of Matthew Remsky's work?
Yes, I am. And I have a big one coming out. I can't say who it is, but yeah, go ahead. What are you going to say about it?
Well, just, looking at that and thinking back on those days and thinking back about my involvement in the Ashtanga Yoga School and even the way that I related to that place, I realized that it was very culty. And I was essentially kicked out of the cult which is a good thing, but because I guess because I opened my studio. And they used to kick people out all the time. So, but yeah, they kicked me out and, told me not to come back. Or maybe it was because I think I broke the camel's back when Patabi Joyce came to Seattle, and I invited people to come to the Samaria Center for like a breakfast, like an informal breakfast, a place to connect. And I had not run that by the powers that be, and so I was kicked out.
I see. So you stepped on some toes.
Correct. I stepped on some toes. I absolutely did. Well, and I didn't mean to.
I'm sorry. I'm sorry to jump in, but did you practiced with Patabi Joyce?
Yeah. Only when he was in the United States. So I never went to India to study with him.
Yeah.
But anytime he would come to the United States, he came to Seattle a lot because the teachers at the Ashtanga Yoga School were like some of the only certified or whatever they called it teachers. And so you remember that was like back in the early 90s.
I know. He would come to New York.
Total thing.
He would come to New York and there'd be like 600 people in the Puck building. I mean, I never went. But
I have been in the Puck building with him. With 600 people staying in a headstand for, what seemed like an eternity. It was when I was in a band and our band was playing there. And then I was like, I have to get up in the morning and go to this yoga thing.
Yes,
and
wait a second. We have to have a side note. I saw that you're a bass player?
Yeah, well,
because I'm a bass player too. That's what I did before I got into yoga.
Get out of here.
No, I played in this like avant band called Dim Sum Clip Job, and then this other band called Dead Blonde Girlfriend. I played in these like rock bands and like toured around the country for a little while before I decided to make yoga my thing. That was like the only other thing I've ever done besides yoga that really made my heart open was like bass.
Oh my God. So that's another total bizarre synchronicity. And I had no idea. Yeah, same. I've been in a whole bunch of bands. I've traveled all over the country and, made a bunch of records and played South by Southwest.
You see, that makes a lot of sense though, because back at that time in the 90s, the lifestyle of a musician was sort of like more like where yoga was, although that's changed for musicians too. Everything changed with the internet, but it was sort of like those kind of counterculture, like communities, that was other, like it wasn't an office job, it was,
right. Very much so. Yeah,
you had tattoos and you could have your own business.
Right. Yeah. Well, and especially like in Seattle, I think we were even more, Seattle was really different then too, because it was so, again, I didn't even think of it, but of course, before so much internet, we were so geographically isolated. So it was like super counterculture up there in a way that it's really not now. But yeah, so I knew lots of people. I didn't know a lot of people that were in bands and played and did yoga.
No,
but,
sometimes they conflict, right? Like when you have to play a Wednesday night, like late, like 2 a.m. to the sound guy, and then you got to teach the early morning class the next morning. That's what happened to me.
Yeah, totally. Or go stand on your head and with 600 people in the Puck building with Patabi Joyce yelling at you, and you've got like
see, that was going to be my next
hangover.
question. My next question was going to be, what was your personal interaction with him?
Oh, with him? Well, I didn't have a lot of personal interactions with him, but in the introduction to my book, I do talk about, like hearing people use this word Guruji, and then suddenly being like, I want a Guruji. And so going to study at these, these big gymnasiums or wherever they would do the, Puck building or big places in Seattle, and everybody like lining up and, wanting to kiss his feet, and me just being like, yeah, I'm not doing that. Mm-hmm. And then also, again, I didn't have a lot of personal interaction, although there's a story in my book where I was in Carlsbad at something hosted by Tim Miller. That was a big Ashtanga thing. And I met this like 80-something-year-old Israeli lady, and she put her mat down right next to mine. And Patabi Joyce came up and like started yelling at her to do whatever. And she just looked at it and just stared him right down and was like, I'm not doing anything you tell me to do. And then they just had like a stare off for a while, and then he, harumphed away. So those are like my main memories. And then also when I had Samaria in the beginning, I told all my students, I was like, oh, you have to go and see this. He's the granddaddy. He's the father of our lineage or whatever. And then, I'm in this room feeling protective from my students while he's like screaming at them and yelling at them and stepping on them. And the first night, like when we got back to my studio, someone was injured, and she was injured for like the rest of the year. And I had just, of course, felt all this guilt and responsibility. So I never had a positive association with Patabi Joyce ever.
Yeah. I mean, I had a friend who got hurt at one of his things too. And I remember being really upset about it. But it's so bizarre because at the time there was just, and that's what Matthew's writing about, that cult aspect of where he was pretty abusive, but there's all this deference and power granted him.
Yeah. And it was such a different time. I mean, like, I just cannot believe how different yoga is now. Like, American yoga, whatever. It's completely different.
Oh, I know. I just got out of the bubble that I was in for 10 years, 2 years ago. Right? And it is crazy. Even in like the last 5 years.
Yeah.
So much shift. Crazy.
Well, yeah, and that's what I was going to say. Even when you were saying that about like the Samaria Center, it is hard for me. Like, I'm so happy in many ways seeing where all of yoga is going, but then the small little kid in me is still like, it is like being in a band. It's like you're making this certain kind of music, and everyone's like, yeah, whatever, that kind of music is, no one wants that music. And then so you quit your band and you get a day job or something, and all of a sudden everyone's making that music, and people are like, oh my God, where's this music been all my life? And you're like, no. So yeah, it is. It's
well, I hear what you're saying, but I know what you're saying. I think there has certainly been like some, like, especially when you were having those conversations way before other people were, and there was a long period of time where nobody was talking about that, along with even just like injuries and yoga and all of that stuff. Like before William J. Broad's article came out, the folks over there at that IYT conference in 2009, everybody was already like on board with a lot of the stuff, but it did start to become a larger conversation. Right,
absolutely.
Well, and then, let's talk a little bit about the Samaria Center though first, because you did open it up. If I recall, it was a not-for-profit originally, right?
Yeah, well, I didn't actually open it as not-for-profit, but I basically just ran it as a not-for-profit. And after, I think, a year and a half, one of my students approached me and offered to do my books. And because I didn't do any, like, I mean, I'm not a good business person.
Yes, I know, me too.
So she offered to do my books, and she started doing my books, and she was like, look, Molly, you should apply for a nonprofit status because you run this place like a nonprofit. And so I did that, and I just did it myself. I don't know what I did. I jumped through all the hoops, and that was a hard sell back then. That to sell to the government that it was a yoga studio, but it was nonprofit. But yeah, so about a year and a half into it, we switched to like being a legit nonprofit. But when we opened, we had like a mission statement and everything, and it was all about access to the teachings and practices of yoga, regardless of perceived barriers, was something. Right. Our mission statement was something like that. Yeah.
I remember.
So from the very beginning,
I wrote it down. Dedicated to individual transformation and radical social change.
Yes.
That was in like 2001.
Yep.
That was really like a way before anyone else. I heard before I had any clue about any of that. There was still it was still on the way big upswell of the wave.
Right.
Nobody was talking about that then.
No, they really weren't. And
why were you though? Why were you talking about it then?
Gosh, why was I talking about it? I've always been an agitator, I guess. And I've always been a questioner. And I think, people used to, I was a therapist first. And so, I was.
That's right. You did speech pathology. Did I write that down right?
Yeah, you got it. Yeah. I was a speech pathologist at the hospital. And so when I left the hospital, I wanted to start the Samaria Center. I really just wanted to start it as a place to practice therapy differently, to create a therapy that involved movement, that involved the whole person, and that came from this place of wholeness. Because the way I was taught clinically, I think the way most people are taught clinically, is that people are broken and it's your job to fix them. And as I was learning just a little bit about yoga, the movement piece was interesting and pleasurable to me. But the philosophy about this idea of like wholeness and perfection and people being inherently whole was just like blowing my mind. So I opened the center really to develop that therapy. And so it kind of just went along with that, because then I was thinking, well, I want all kinds of people coming into this center, not just people who can afford it. And so I want to make sure that people are able to come in no matter what their financial means are, no matter kind of what they look like, or, how they present, or all that sort of stuff. And then I started doing different kinds of like outreach programs. And so it all just happened sort of really slowly and organically. And so when people, back then I got to do a lot of interviews, and people would ask me that, how did you get started on this? And, I honestly just believe it's like, it just came from my family. Like it came from me, but it came from my family. My whole family is very social justice oriented, equality oriented, access oriented, progressive. I was just raised that way. I was raised that you're supposed to help people. I was raised that you have civic duty that you're supposed to do. And I was raised that you're supposed to question the status quo and not be afraid.
You question the status quo. That's and not be afraid. Yes, you see, that's the yoga I signed on to. That's the yoga I signed on to too. Like the yoga that was about that.
Right. Yeah.
Wow.
Yeah.
And then, so that's why you were also at the IYT and involved, because they were the ones developing the standards for yoga therapy.
Right. Well, it was way before that, actually, because John Kepner, I was featured in Yoga Journal for working with kids with autism. I think that was in 2001 also. Oh. John Kepner has a nephew, I think, with autism. So John Kepner, I had no idea who he was, but reached out to me and said, oh, you're doing this work with kids with autism. Well, I have a nephew with autism. Do you want to write about yoga and autism it was back then, it was International Journal of Yoga Therapy.
Yes, I remember.
And I was like, yes, I do want to do that. And that I wasn't so lazy as I am now, I guess. I was like,
well, it was very different times. See, I wrote for that too. I wrote for Yoga Therapy and Practice, which they then changed to Yoga Today. And I had one thing in the journal as well. Back then it was Kelly McGonigal was the editor when I was writing for them. But I remembered that's how I ended up at that conference, because I was trying to figure out what to call this training program that I had started. Like, I didn't know what to write for the like marketing. You know what I mean? I was like, what do I call this? And then I saw it was like a yoga journal issue that had the choose your style. And it had the grid, and it had like, Patabi Joyce Ashtanga, BKS Iyengar. Then it had John Friend Anyasara at that time. And then at the very end, it had a picture of Desikachar and Krishnamacharya. And underneath that, it said yoga therapy. And I was like, oh, what's this yoga therapy? And I started poking around. And I ended up having a conversation with John Kepner, too, like an hour. Just like, what's yoga therapy, man? I'm doing this thing. It sounds, I'm inspired by Desikachar. Is Desikachar yoga therapy? And he basically said, well, listen, we're having this conference and we're having this council of schools meeting. Why don't you come participate? And that's why I ended up going there and meeting you. So you were already developing programs.
Yeah. And I had gotten involved with them. And to be honest, I was like really, and I'm still a little bit like this. I was pretty snooty about the idea of yoga therapy, especially when I had just left the hospital and, was just getting into yoga. And again, I mean, it was just so different. I mean, we keep saying that it was so different. And so to me, when people were saying yoga therapist, I was like, I want to really differentiate myself from that because that sounds like a bunch of bullshit. Yeah. To me, just as a clinician, having gone through, 3 years of grad school and 2 years of internship at the hospital and then working at the hospital, like this idea that sort of anyone could be this like yoga therapist thing, I was like, no. I don't want to be competing with those people. I'm doing is real.
Interesting because that's what I observed when I went to that meeting. Like and that's what I wrote in the journal. I wrote, there seemed to me to be some people who wanted to make it a clinical application of yoga. And then there were other people who were working therapeutically, but I called them the preventative care yoga therapists because I didn't know what else to call them. But there was like a process-oriented people, and then there was prescriptive people. But this idea of making it clinical, and I was very weary of that too, because all the people who were coming to me, they had lots of doctors. They had lots of doctors already. They didn't need more doctors, and I'm not a doctor. And what yoga did for me wasn't about soap notes,
Right. Yeah, exactly. And that was the irony too about when I ended up joining the board, and then as part of the board, I was the board liaison to those educational standards. That's how I was involved in that. And I was ultimately, I'm being cautious, but I was a little disappointed, I guess. Because to me, I didn't end up registering my program with IAYT because I was like, well, I'm not a yoga therapist, and what I do is not yoga therapy.
I made the same determination.
Yeah, because what had happened is I left the hospital in 1999 because I didn't want to work with people in a pathological way, and I felt frustrated that of all that could have. You're basically starting from whole cloth. You can create anything. You're creating this new discipline. And basically it was modeled after the medical model, which is irrevocably broken in the United States. And so why would we try to replicate that model? And what I saw often, and my colleague Stephanie Sisson was on there and Marlisa Sullivan was on there. And I believe we were the only 3 clinicians that were on the standards committee. And one of the things all 3 of us would often notice is that the non-clinicians were way more like conservative and clinical, I guess, than the ones that were clinicians. And I think it had something to do with about feelings of legitimacy, honestly. And so it's sort of like you're doing all the right things and you're saying the word soap note and you're wearing, your white lab coat and you're using a clipboard, and all of us who had been trained clinically were like, I don't need to be legitimized because I already have that piece of paper from the University of Washington that legitimizes me. And so we're trying to get away from that, which is why we were interested in yoga therapy. So it was a very interesting dynamic tension.
Well, I really appreciate
that develop.
Because in the meeting, what I remember is it was sort of just the beginning of something. So there did seem like there might be any possibility to it, but it seems like there wasn't any consensus in the room about what some standards should be because there was so much diversity of approach, and like what a Kundalini yoga therapist needed to learn wasn't the same thing as what a Iyengar yoga therapist needed to learn. And I think that it did, and we ended up kind of losing that argument, and it did kind of go in a more clinical direction as you're describing. And I think that I see it even now, and I don't really want to talk about this because there's other things I want to talk about that are more important, that even with the Yoga Alliance right now trying to reform the 200-hour standards, there's kind of a lack of vision about what is possible, a way of doing things that would be actually, I've been studying sociocracy some. I don't know if you know anything about that, but
no. Sociocracy, I have no idea. I've never even heard that word before.
It's sometimes called dynamic governance, and it's a way of kind of organizing and making things happen in a way that's more communal. They have this idea of a hierarchy of function rather than a hierarchy of power, but it's not about making a consensus necessarily. It's very interesting. I did a whole episode on it, but it's just got some principles in there that I think are, when you said that you were disappointed because you were like, we're starting from nothing and it could really be whatever we want to imagine it. And then to have it imagined in a way that seems to model things that are already not working that great. That's the same feeling I have in general when it comes to people trying to do standards. It's like, if we're going to do something, we should do something that's not been done, that's going to maybe move forward. And even if we have to change it later, but to just model after things that are already not working doesn't seem to make sense to me.
Exactly. And I think that for me, one of the places that I'm most interested in right now, and I think this has been for a long time, but when I left the hospital, part of what I envisioned when I would call it yoga-based therapy was the true heart of the clinician, and that we were never taught in graduate school how to be with people or how to examine our own selves or how to examine our own shit and our own biases and all that sort of thing. So when I started integrated movement therapy, that was the big focus. And I would say that to people. I'd say, the yoga in this therapy is the yoga that's in you. That's what I would always say. And what I feel like is, whether it's the Yoga Alliance standards, and I don't know how you standardize this, but the Yoga Alliance standard or the IOAT standards, or again, where yoga is, it appears to me in general, is that there's no real emphasis on the whole entire spiritual spectrum, which is essentially what the practice is, with these asanas put in there for whatever the heck they're put in there for, right? But and that's the part that I just am like, well, what about and Steph, my colleague, and I used to say we wanted to do a study where we taught back-to-back classes where, one, we just told people how to do the poses and told them about alignment and everything like that, and completely secular. And then we had the same class, same sequences, same everything, but we talked the way that she and I both normally talk about whatever original divinity and, loving yourself and your connection to the divine, or, whatever, all that kind of stuff. And we wanted to see, how people do an 8-week series or something, and then ask at the end, what had changed them? What had they taken away from these yoga classes? Because we both really felt that, that the poses without the spirituality was just fun, interesting exercise, right? So that's the part that that's the part I didn't see people really talking about, and I don't see it in the Yoga Alliance standards. And I don't even know how you would standardize that.
Well, see, that's exactly it, because what you're pointing to is exactly where I ended up, which is you're pointing to these sort of contemplative aspects of the practice,
right?
And only using the physicalities to serve that. But this contemplative thing, it's kind of about tapping into the void, or the intuition, or the unknown, and the standardization or the clinical application undermines that. Now, I don't think that they're mutually exclusive of one another.
No,
but I do think that if you try to work, the metaphor I used was midwifery. I knew these midwives who tried to work in hospitals and ended up having to decide to only do home births because they felt like they couldn't do their work in the hospital setting. So it's almost like sometimes
Sure.
this idea that you're saying, this biopsychosocial idea, doesn't always fit if it's in a frame that's already like allopathic oriented or whatever, you know? It needs a different frame
Right.
to work.
Absolutely. And we need to stop being, well, we don't need to, but for me, like to give me joy as far as like my own teaching or my own evolution is thinking about just really the depth of what yoga is and can be as a contemplative practice and as a mystical practice, and figuring out ways so that people aren't so afraid of that, right? Like afraid of using the word God or afraid of talking about these connections to the divine. And frankly, I don't think most people are taught that even in their teacher trainings, or I don't know which teachers are talking about that at a level where like sort of the masses want to listen. Mm-hmm. Like I have this article that's been bumping around in my head for a while that I'm going to call Yoga is Dangerous as a Spiritual Practice. Mm-hmm. And what I actually mean by that is that, I'll jump ahead for a moment. I'm just about to graduate from the Living School, which is a part of the Center for Action and Contemplation with Father Richard Rohr. I don't know if you've ever heard of him, but a lot of yoga people seem to like Richard Rohr.
No, I don't know what that is.
Oh man, he's amazing. He's a Franciscan priest. He's probably in his mid 70s or something. And he basically, he's still a practicing Catholic, but he just pushes up against the edges constantly and questions all of the orthodoxy around Christianity, and basically says that, you know, we've got it all wrong and that people have been pushed out of the church because they've forgotten about what he calls Christ. And he'll say people know about Jesus, but they don't know about Christ. They only know about Christ if it's Jesus' last name. And he talks about Christ. He just wrote a book that's now like a New York Times bestseller called The Universal Christ. But he talks about Christ consciousness as this thing that has been there for forever and will always be there. And only at some certain point in time did Jesus come as like an incarnation of this Christ consciousness, which is this essential wholeness that has always existed. And so the way he talks and the way he writes, you're like, this is completely Vedantic thought. This is completely
it's non-dual Christianity,
thought.
Non-dual Christianity, huh?
It is. Exactly. And it's so fascinating to me. And, you know, and I've loved it. But one of the reasons I went to his program was because of that. Is I saw so many folks in my teacher trainings who had pushed away Christianity, Catholicism, whatever it was that they grew up with, but like, you know, like this, or like really like pushed it away. That's not the word I'm looking for. Like, you know, get me away from it. And I can understand why, right? Because they'd been indoctrinated into like the domination paradigm of Christianity. So then they go over to like what they call, you know, Eastern religions, and over there, everything's completely idealized, right? And perfect, and no one's wounding anybody, and no one's excluding anyone, which of course is bullshit,
which is,
right?
we all found out was not true.
Right? And we all found that's not true anyway. But then what I've noticed happens is that people grasp onto, like, let's say yoga philosophy, and then they take it at this extremely superficial level. Because if you go to something like a church, and I mean, obviously everything I'm saying could be taken with a grain of salt. Not all priests are good priests or good preachers or good preachers or what have you. But you go to a place, or the Vedanta Society, or wherever you're going, that you're listening to someone speaking that's speaking directly about the heart of their religion or of their philosophy or something. They're speaking from this depth of experience and practice and knowledge. People go to yoga classes, they've got, you know, I'm like the old lady in the room now practically at 53, right? So everybody else is in, right? They're in their 20s and they're talking about these like quote unquote like deep religious things, but they're not talking about anything deep. They're talking about the yamas and the niyamas and knowing them at this like extremely superficial level. So back to my idea, like yoga is dangerous as a spiritual practice. What I believe and what I'll eventually write about is that people glom onto this spiritual practice without examining its faults, but also without going any deeper. So they go to their twice-a-week yoga class, they hear their 25-year-old teacher talk about, you know, ahimsa, and then they're like, I'm good. You know, I practice ahimsa, I'm good. So that, therefore, I already have a spiritual practice. I don't need another one. And what I think is like, that's like eating like knockoff brand, peanut M&Ms when you could be eating whatever, truffles directly from Switzerland.
Those knockoff brands, they suck. We got them for my daughters for Christmas, and they were not having it. They were like, these aren't real M&Ms.
Right, it's not the real thing. But if it's the only thing you've ever had, you're like, oh, this is delicious. Why would I want anything else? And someone's like, here, want real M&Ms? And you're like, no, I've got this,
Yeah.
So I see that as being, to me, a real lacking in the yoga world, let's say, even the way people have conversations. I mean, the vitriol, the way people respond to each other. I mean, that's a lot of just online stuff anyway.
Well, yeah, that's some online stuff. And it did change once the internet came. But I really hear what you're saying. My most recent blog post from last month is entitled "Yoga is Not Convenient." So, it's like we are like resonating because it's a lot of times, even in the way we're marketing it, there's this idea that you want to make it as convenient as possible for someone to buy it. But ultimately, what we're selling is not convenient. And in a way, it doesn't make sense. And that's the sort of little bit of dilemma. And it does bring me to the next thing I wanted to ask you about. If you are hearing this message, then you're listening to the free version of Jay Brown Yoga Talks. To hear the rest of our conversation, please subscribe to Podcast Premium at jbrownyoga.com/premium.